Welcome back. I am Pemberton, and this is part 30 of Josephus' Wars and the most terrible chapter in the whole book. The banks are finished and the battering rams brought up, but they can do nothing against the temple's gates, so Titus orders the gates set on fire. Then he calls his commanders to a council and asks the fateful question: shall the temple be spared or destroyed? He himself, Josephus, insists wish to save it. But in the chaos of the next day's fighting, a single soldier, without any order, snatches up a burning brand and throws it through a window, and the holy house, against Caesar's own command, is set ablaze and consumed. What follows is the slaughter and the plunder amid the flames, a false prophet, the dreadful signs that went before, the Romans planting their standards in the temple court, and their acclamation of Titus. Let us go on.
2 of the legions completed their banks on the 8th day of the month Lus or Ab. Titus then ordered the battering rams to be brought and set against the western building of the inner temple. Before these rams were brought, the strongest of all the other engines had battered the wall continuously for 6 days without making any impression on it. The immense size and strong joining of the stones proved superior to that engine and to the other battering rams as well. Other Romans did undermine the foundations of the northern gate, and after an immense amount of labor, they removed the outermost stones, yet the gate was still held up by the inner stones and remained standing unharmed. At last the workmen despaired of all such attempts with engines and crows, and brought their ladders to the cloisters. The Jews did not interrupt them while they were doing this. But when the Romans had climbed up, the Jews fell upon them and fought them. Some they thrust down and threw backward headlong, others they met and killed. They also struck many of those who were going back down the ladders, killing them with their swords before they could bring their shields around to protect themselves. They even threw down some of the ladders from above while they were full of armed men. A great slaughter of the Jews was also made at the same time, while those who carried the ensigns fought hard for them, because they thought it a terrible thing, and one that would bring them great shame, if they allowed the ensigns to be stolen away. Yet at length the Jews got possession of these engines and destroyed those who had gone up the ladders. The rest were so terrified by what happened to those who had been killed that they withdrew, although none of the Romans died without first having done good service. Among the seditious, those who had fought bravely in the earlier battles did the same now, and besides them Eleazar, the brother's son of Simon the Tyrant. But when Titus perceived that his efforts to spare a foreign temple were turning to the injury and death of his soldiers, he gave the order to set the gates on fire. Meanwhile Ananus deserted to him from Emmaus, the bloodiest of all Simon's guards, along with Archelaus, the son of Magadatus. They hoped still to be forgiven because they left the Jews at a time when the Jews were victorious. Titus objected to this as a cunning trick of theirs. Since he had also been informed of their other barbarities toward the Jews, he was in great haste to have them both killed. He told them that they had been driven to this desertion only by the extreme distress they were in, and had not come away because of any good disposition of their own. He said that those men did not deserve to be preserved by whom their own city had already been set on fire, out of which fire they were now hurrying themselves away. Nevertheless, the security he had promised to deserters overcame his resentment, and he dismissed them accordingly, though he did not give them the same privileges he had given to others. By now the soldiers had already set fire to the gates. The silver that covered them quickly carried the flames to the wood inside, and from there the fire spread suddenly and caught hold of the cloisters. When the Jews saw this fire all around them, their spirits sank along with their bodies, and they were so astonished that not one of them hurried either to defend himself or to put out the fire. They stood only as silent spectators of it. Yet they did not grieve over the loss of what was now burning in such a way as to become wiser for the future. Said, as though the holy house itself had already been set on fire, they sharpened their passions against the Romans. This fire continued through that day and the next also, for the soldiers could not burn all the surrounding cloisters at one time, but only in sections. On the next day, Titus commanded part of his army to quench the fire, and make a road so the legions could march up more easily. He himself gathered the commanders together. 6 principal men assembled: Tiberius Alexander, the commander under the general of the whole army; Sextus Cerealis, commander of the 5th legion; Lartius Lepidus, commander of the 10th legion; Titus Phrygius, commander of the 15th legion; Eternius, leader of the 2 legions that had come from Alexandria; and Marcus Antonius Julianus, procurator of Judea. After these came all the rest of the procurators and tribunes. Titus asked them to give him their advice about what should be done with the holy house. Some of them thought the best course was to act according to the rules of war and demolish it, because the Jews would never stop rebelling while that house stood, since it was there that they used to gather together. Others held that if the Jews would leave it and none of them would store their arms in it, he might save it, but if they climbed upon it and fought any more, he might burn it, because it would then have to be regarded not as a holy house but as a citadel. In that case the impiety of burning it would belong to those who forced it to be done, not to them. Even if the Jews should climb upon that holy house and fight us from there, we still ought not to avenge ourselves on lifeless things instead of on the men themselves. I am in no case in favor of burning down so vast a work as this, because that would be a loss to the Romans themselves, while, if it remains, it will be an ornament to their government. At this declaration Fronto, Alexander, and Cerealis grew bold and agreed with Titus's opinion. The assembly was then dissolved after Titus had ordered the commanders that the rest of their forces should remain still, but that they should use the most courageous men in this attack. So he commanded that the chosen men taken from the cohorts should make their way through the ruins and quench the fire. It is true that on this day the Jews were so weary and so filled with consternation that they made no attacks. But on the next day they gathered their whole force, and about the 2nd hour of the day ran very boldly through the east gate against those who guarded the outer court of the temple. These guards received their attack with great bravery, covering themselves in front with their shields as if with a wall, and drawing their squadron close together. Yet it was clear that they could not remain there very long, but would be overwhelmed by the multitude of those who sallied out against them, and by the heat of their passion. Caesar, seeing from the tower of Antonia that this squadron was likely to give way, sent some chosen horsemen to support them. At this the Jews found themselves unable to withstand their attack, and when those in the front were slaughtered, many of the rest were put to flight. But as the Romans began to withdraw, the Jews turned on them and fought them, and when those Romans came back against them, the Jews retreated again. This continued until about the 5th hour of the day, when the Jews were overborne and shut themselves up in the inner court of the temple. Titus then withdrew into the tower of Antonia, and resolved to storm the temple early the next morning with his whole army, and to encamp all around the holy house. But as for that house, God had certainly long ago doomed it to the fire. Now the fatal day had come, according to the revolution of ages, the 10th day of the month Lous or Ab, the very day on which it had formerly been burned by the king of Babylon. Yet these flames had their beginning from the Jews themselves, and were caused by them. After Titus withdrew, the seditious lay still for a little while, and then attacked the Romans again. Those who guarded the holy house fought with those who were quenching the fire burning in the inner court of the temple. But these Romans put the Jews to flight and advanced as far as the holy house itself. At that time one of the soldiers, without waiting for any order, and without concern or fear over so great an undertaking, being driven on by a certain divine fury, snatched something from the burning materials. Lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window through which there was a passage to the rooms around the holy house on its north side. As the flames rose upward, the Jews made a great outcry, such as so mighty an affliction required, and ran together to prevent it. They no longer spared their lives or allowed anything to restrain their force, since the holy house was perishing, the very place for whose sake they had kept such guard. A certain person came running to Titus and told him of this fire, while he was resting in his tent after the last battle. Titus rose in great haste, and just as he was, ran to the holy house to have the fire stopped. All his commanders followed after him, and after them the several legions followed in great astonishment. A great clamor and tumult arose, as was natural when so large an army moved in disorder. Then Caesar, both by calling in a loud voice to the soldiers who were fighting, and by signaling to them with his right hand, ordered them to quench the fire. But they did not hear what he said, though he spoke so loudly, because their ears had already been dulled by an even greater noise elsewhere. Nor did they pay attention to the signal he made with his hand, since some of them were still distracted by fighting and others by passion. As for the legions that came running there, neither persuasion nor threats could restrain their violence, but each man's own passion was his commander at that time. As they crowded together into the temple, many were trampled by one another, while a great number fell among the ruins of the cloisters, which were still hot and smoking, and were destroyed in the same miserable way as those whom they had conquered. When they came near the holy house, they acted as if they did not even hear Caesar's orders to the contrary, but encouraged those in front of them to set it on fire. The seditious were already in too much distress to give any help toward putting out the fire. They were everywhere being killed and everywhere being beaten. As for a great part of the people, they were weak and unarmed, and their throats were cut wherever they were caught. Around the altar dead bodies lay heaped one upon another, and down the steps leading up to it ran a great quantity of their blood. There also the dead bodies that had been slain above on the altar fell down. Since Caesar was in no way able to restrain the soldiers' enthusiastic fury, and the fire kept spreading more and more, he went into the holy place of the temple with his commanders and saw it and what was in it. He found it far superior to what foreigners had reported, and not inferior to what we ourselves boasted of and believed about it. The flame had not yet reached its inner parts, but was still consuming the rooms around the holy house. Titus supposed, correctly, that the house itself might still be saved. So he came in haste, and tried to persuade the soldiers to quench the fire. He also ordered Liberalius the centurion, and one of the spearmen around him, to beat the disobedient soldiers with their staves and restrain them. Yet their passions were too strong for their regard for Caesar, and for their fear of the man who forbade them. Their hatred of the Jews, and a certain violent inclination to fight them were too strong as well. Moreover, the hope of plunder led many onward, because they believed that all the places within were full of money, and because they saw that everything around it was made of gold. Besides this, one of those who went into the place acted before Caesar could stop him. As Caesar ran out so quickly to restrain the soldiers, this man threw fire upon the hinges of the gate in the dark. Immediately the flame burst out from within the holy house itself. Then the commanders withdrew, and Caesar with them, and no one any longer forbade those outside to set fire to it. Thus the holy house was burned down without Caesar's approval. Anyone would rightly lament the destruction of such a work, since it was the most admirable of all the works we have seen or heard of, both for the workmanship of its structure, and for its magnitude, for the vast wealth bestowed upon it, and for the glorious reputation it had for holiness. Yet such a person might comfort himself with the thought that fate had decreed it so, and fate is inevitable for living creatures, works, and places alike. Still, one cannot help wondering at the exactness of the period connected with it, for as I said before, the same month and day were now observed on which the holy house had formerly been burned by the Babylonians. The number of years from its first foundation, laid by King Solomon, to this destruction, which happened in the 2nd year of the reign of Vespasian, is reckoned as 1,130 years, besides 7 months and 15 days. From its second building, which was done by Haggai in the 2nd year of Cyrus the king, to its destruction under Vespasian, there were 639 years and 45 days. While the holy house was on fire, everything that came to hand was plundered, and 10,000 of those who were caught were killed. There was no pity for any age and no reverence for dignity. Children, old men, ordinary people, and priests were all killed in the same way. This war swept around every sort of man and brought them all to destruction, both those who begged for their lives, and those who defended themselves by fighting. The flame also spread a long way, and made an echo together with the groans of those who were slain. Because the hill was high and the works of the temple were very great, one would have thought the whole city was on fire. Nor can anyone imagine anything greater or more terrible than this noise. There was at once the shout of the Roman legions marching all together, and the sad clamor of the seditious, who were now surrounded by fire and sword. The people who were left above were beaten back upon the enemy, and in great consternation they made mournful cries over the calamity they were under. The multitude in the city joined its outcry with those on the hill. Besides this, many who had been worn away by famine, and whose mouths were almost closed, exerted their remaining strength when they saw the fire of the holy house, and broke out again into groans and cries. Hurry also returned the echo, as did the mountains around the city, and increased the force of the whole noise. Yet the misery itself was more terrible than this disorder. One would have thought that the hill on which the temple stood was itself boiling hot, being full of fire in every part, that the blood was greater in quantity than the fire, and that those slain were more numerous than those who slew them. The ground was nowhere visible because of the dead bodies lying on it, but the soldiers ran over heaps of bodies as they attacked those who fled from them. Now the multitude of robbers were driven out of the inner court of the temple by the Romans, and they had great difficulty getting into the outer court, and from there into the city, while the remainder of the populace fled into the cloister of that outer court. As for the priests, some of them pulled up from the holy house the spikes that were upon it, together with their laid bases, and threw them at the Romans instead of darts. But since they gained nothing by this, and since the fire burst out upon them, they withdrew to the wall that was 8 cubits broad and remained there. Yet 2 of the more eminent among them, who might have saved themselves by going over to the Romans, or else endured their fate with courage alongside the others, threw themselves into the fire and were burned together with the holy house. Their names were Maris the son of Belgas, and Joseph the son of Dalius. The Romans, now judging that it was useless to spare what surrounded the holy house, burnt all those places, as well as what remained of the cloisters and the gates, except for 2, one on the east side and one on the south. These 2 they burned later. They also burned down the treasury chambers, where an immense quantity of money, an immense number of garments, and other precious goods had been stored. In short, the whole wealth of the Jews had been heaped up there, while rich people had built chambers there to contain such furnishings. The soldiers also came to the rest of the cloisters in the outer court of the temple, where women, children, and a great mixed multitude of the people had fled, about 6,000 in number. But before Caesar had decided anything about these people or given the commanders any orders concerning them, the soldiers were in such a rage that they set that cloister on fire. As a result, some of these people were destroyed by throwing themselves down headlong, and others were burned in the cloisters themselves. Not one of them escaped with his life. A false prophet was the cause of these people's destruction. On that very day, he had made a public proclamation in the city that God commanded them to go up onto the temple, and that there they would receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. There were at that time a great number of false prophets, hired by the tyrants to deceive the people, who announced to them that they should wait for deliverance from God. This was done to keep them from deserting, and so that they might be lifted above fear and care by such hopes. A man in adversity easily gives way to such promises. When a deceiver makes him believe that he will be delivered from the miseries oppressing him, then the sufferer becomes full of hopes for that deliverance. Thus the miserable people were persuaded by these deceivers, who lied against God himself. They did not pay attention to or give credit to the signs that were so evident and so plainly foretold their future desolation. Instead, like men infatuated, with no eyes to see and no minds to consider, they disregarded the warnings that God gave them. There was a star resembling a sword, which stood over the city, and a comet that continued for a whole year. Before the Jews' rebellion, and before the disturbances that preceded the war, when the people had come in great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread, on the 8th day of the month Xanthicus, or Nisan, at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime. This lasted for half an hour. To the unskilful, this light seemed to be a good sign, but the sacred scribes interpreted it as foretelling the events that immediately followed. At the same festival, a heifer, as she was being led by the high priest to be sacrificed, gave birth to a lamb in the middle of the temple. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was made of brass and extremely heavy, and which could be shut only with difficulty by 20 men, rested on an iron-plated base, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was made there of one whole stone. This gate was seen to open of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. Those who kept watch in the temple ran to the captain of the temple and told him of it. He came up there, and only with great difficulty was he able to shut the gate again. This also appeared to the common people to be a very happy prodigy, as though God had thereby opened to them the gate of happiness. But the men of learning understood it to mean that the security of their holy house had been dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate had been opened for the advantage of their enemies. So they publicly declared that the signal foreshowed the desolation coming upon them. Besides these things, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month Artemisius or Gr, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem like a fable if it were not related by those who saw it, and if the events that followed it were not so significant as to deserve such signs. Before sunset, chariots and troops of soldiers in armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding cities. Moreover, at the feast we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as was their custom, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that first they felt a quaking and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude. Let us remove hence. What is still more terrible, there was one Jesus, the son of Ananias, a common man and a husbandman. 4 years before the war began, at a time when the city was in very great peace and prosperity, he came to the feast at which it is our custom for everyone to make tabernacles to God in the temple. Suddenly he began to cry aloud. A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, and a voice against this whole people. This was his cry as he went about by day and by night through all the lanes of the city. Certain of the most eminent among the populace were greatly angered by this dreadful cry of his, took up the man, and gave him a great number of severe blows. Yet he did not say anything on his own behalf, nor anything particular to those who punished him, but still went on with the same words he had cried before. At this our rulers, supposing, as the case proved, that this was a kind of divine fury in the man, brought him to the Roman procurator. There he was whipped until his bones were laid bare. Yet he made no supplication for himself and shed no tears. Instead, turning his voice to the most mournful tone possible, at every stroke of the whip he answered, Woe to Jerusalem! When Albinus, who was then our procurator, asked him who he was, where he came from, and why he uttered such words, he made no reply at all to what was said, but still did not stop his melancholy song, until Albinus took him for a madman and dismissed him. During all the time that passed before the war began, this man did not approach any of the citizens, nor was he seen by them while he spoke in this way. But every day he uttered these lamentable words, as if it were his premeditated vow, Woe to Jerusalem! He did not speak evil words to any of those who beat him every day, nor good words to those who gave him food. This was his reply to all men, and indeed it was nothing other than a melancholy warning of what was to come. His cry was loudest at the festivals, and he continued the song for 7 years and 5 months without growing hoarse or weary of it, until the very time when he saw his warning fulfilled in earnest during our siege, and then it ceased. As he was going around on the wall, he cried out with all his strength, Woe to the city again, and to the people, and to the holy house! Woe to myself also! Just as he added those last words, a stone from one of the engines struck him and killed him immediately. As he was uttering the very same warnings, he gave up the ghost. Now, if anyone considers these things, he will find that God takes care of mankind, and in every possible way shows our race beforehand what is for its preservation, but that men perish by the miseries they madly and voluntarily bring upon themselves. For the Jews, by demolishing the tower of Antonia, had made their temple foursquare, while at the same time it was written in their sacred oracles that their city and their holy house would be taken when once their temple became foursquare. But what most elevated them in undertaking this war was an ambiguous oracle also found in their sacred writings, saying that about that time one from their country would become governor of the habitable earth. The Jews took this prediction as belonging particularly to themselves, and many of the wise men were deceived in their judgment by it. Yet this oracle certainly pointed to the government of Vespasian, who was appointed emperor in Judea. However, it is not possible for men to avoid fate, even when they see it beforehand. These men interpreted some of the signs according to their own pleasure, and utterly despised others, until their madness was demonstrated both by the taking of their city and by their own destruction. When the seditious fled into the city, and when the holy house itself, and all the buildings around it had been burned, the Romans brought their ensigns to the temple and set them opposite its eastern gate. There they offered sacrifices to them, and there, with the greatest joyful acclamations, they proclaimed Titus imperator. All the soldiers now had such vast quantities of spoils gained by plunder that in Syria a pound weight of gold was sold for half its former value. As for the priests who still remained on the wall of the holy house, there was a boy among them who, because of his thirst, asked some of the Roman guards to give him their right hands as security for his life, and confessed that he was very thirsty. The guards pitied his age and his distress, and gave him their right hands accordingly. So he came down, drank some water, filled the vessel he had brought with him, and then went off and fled back to his own friends. None of the guards could overtake him, but they reproached him for his faithlessness. He answered them, "I have not broken the agreement. The security I was given was not for my staying with you, but only for my coming down safely and taking up some water. I have done both of those things, and therefore I think I have been faithful to my engagement." Those whom the child had deceived admired his cunning, especially because of his age. On the 5th day afterward, the priests who were wasted with famine came down. When the guards brought them to Titus, they begged for their lives. But he replied that the time for pardon was over for them, and that the very holy house on whose account alone they could justly have hoped to be preserved had been destroyed. He said it was fitting for their office that priests should perish with the house to which they belonged. So he ordered them to be put to death. As for the tyrants themselves and those with them, when they found that they were surrounded on every side, and as it were, walled in with no way to escape, they asked to speak with Titus by word of mouth. Because his nature was kind, and because he desired to preserve the city from destruction, and also because his friends advised him, and now thought the robbers had come to a more reasonable temper, Titus placed himself on the western side of the outer court of the temple. There were gates on that side above the Xystus, and a bridge connected the upper city to the temple. This bridge lay between the tyrants and Caesar, and separated them, while the multitude stood on each side, those of the Jewish nation around Simon and John, with great hopes of pardon, and the Romans around Caesar, in great expectation of how Titus would receive their supplication. Titus ordered his soldiers to restrain their rage and hold back their darts, and he appointed an interpreter between them, which was a sign that he was the conqueror. Then he began the speech. "I hope, sirs, that you are now satisfied with the miseries of your country. You have had no just understanding either of our great power or of your own great weakness, but like madmen, violently and without consideration, you have made attempts that have brought your people, your city, and your holy house to destruction. You are the men who have never stopped rebelling since Pompey first conquered you, and since that time you have made open war with the Romans. Have you depended on your multitude when a very small part of the Roman soldiery has been strong enough for you? Have you relied on the fidelity of your allies? What nations outside the limits of our dominion would choose to assist the Jews before the Romans? Are your bodies stronger than ours? You know that even the strong Germans are our servants. Have you stronger walls than we have? What greater obstacle is there than the wall of the ocean, by which the Britons are surrounded? Yet they adore the arms of the Romans. Do you surpass us in courage of soul, or in the wisdom of your commanders? Indeed, you cannot help knowing that even the Carthaginians have been conquered by us. It can therefore certainly be nothing but the kindness of us Romans that has stirred you up against us. In the first place, we gave you this land to possess. Next, we set over you kings of your own nation. Third, we preserved the laws of your forefathers for you, and also permitted you to live either by yourselves or among others, as you pleased. And, what is our chief favor of all, we allowed you to collect the tribute paid to God, and the other gifts dedicated to him. We did not call those who carried these donations to account, nor did we forbid them, until at length you became richer than we ourselves, even while you were our enemies, and you made preparations for war against us with our own money. After enjoying all these advantages, you turned your too great plenty against those who gave it to you, and like merciless serpents, you poured out your poison against those who treated you kindly. I suppose, therefore, that you may have despised the slothfulness of Nero, and that like limbs of the body that are broken or dislocated, you then lay quiet, waiting for another time, though still with malicious intent. Now you have shown your disease to be greater than ever, and have extended your desires as far as your shameless and enormous hopes allowed. At that time my father came into this country, not with a design to punish you for what you had done under Cestius, but to admonish you. If he had come to overthrow your nation, he would have gone straight to your fountainhead, and would immediately have laid this city waste. Instead he went and burnt Galilee and the neighboring parts, thereby giving you time for repentance. You took this example of humanity as proof of his weakness and nourished your impudence by our mildness. When Nero had gone out of the world, you did what the wickedest wretches would have done, and encouraged yourselves to act against us because of our civil dissensions. You abused the time when both my father and I had gone away to Egypt to make preparations for this war. Nor were you ashamed to raise disturbances against us when we were made emperors, even though you had experienced how mild we had been when we were no more than generals of the army. But when the government came to us, and all other peoples lay quiet, and even foreign nations sent embassies and congratulated our accession to the government, then you Jews showed yourselves to be our enemies. You sent embassies to those of your nation beyond Euphrates to help you raise disturbances. You built new walls around your city. Seditions arose, One tyrant contended against another, and a civil war broke out among you, such indeed as suited no one but so wicked a people as you are. I then came to the city, unwillingly sent by my father, and received sorrowful instructions from him. When I heard that the people were disposed toward peace, I rejoiced at it. I exhorted you to abandon these proceedings before I began this war. I spared you even after you had fought against me for a long time. I gave my right hand as security to the deserters, and I faithfully observed what I had promised. When they fled to me, I had compassion on many of those I had taken captive. I tortured those who were eager for war in order to restrain them. It was unwillingly that I brought my engines of war against your walls. I always forbade my soldiers, when they were set upon slaughtering you, from using severity against you. After every victory I persuaded you to peace, as though I myself had been conquered. When I came near your temple, I again departed from the laws of war, and exhorted you to spare your own sanctuary and preserve your holy house for yourselves. I allowed you a quiet exit from it and security for your preservation. Indeed, if you wished, I gave you leave to fight in another place. Yet you have still despised every one of my proposals, and have set fire to your holy house with your own hands. And now, vile wretches, do you desire to speak with me by word of mouth? For what purpose would you save such a holy house as this was, now that it is destroyed? What preservation can you now desire after the destruction of your temple? Yet even now you stand in your armor, and you cannot bring yourselves even to pretend to be supplicants in this utmost extremity. O miserable creatures, what do you depend on? Are your people not dead? Is your holy house not gone? Is your city not in my power? Are your own lives not in my hands? And do you still think it a part of valor to die? Nevertheless, I will not imitate your madness. If you throw down your arms and deliver up your bodies to me, I grant you your lives. I will act like a mild master of a family. What cannot be healed shall be punished, and the rest I will preserve for my own use. To this offer of Titus they replied that they could not accept it, because they had sworn never to do so. That they asked to be allowed to pass through the wall that had been made around them, with their wives and children, saying that they would go into the desert and leave the city to him. As Titus was greatly indignant that, when they were in the condition of men already taken captive, they pretended to make their own terms with him as if they were conquerors. So he ordered a proclamation to be made to them. They were no longer to come out to him as deserters, nor were they to hope for any further security, for from now on he would spare nobody but would fight them with his whole army. They must save themselves as best they could, for from then on he would treat them according to the laws of war. He then ordered the soldiers both to burn and to plunder the city. They did nothing that day, but on the next day they set fire to the repository of the archives, to Acra, to the council house, and to the place called Awfulus. At that time the fire advanced as far as the palace of Queen Helena, which was in the middle of Acra. The lanes also were burned down, as were the houses that were full of the dead bodies of those destroyed by famine. On that same day, the sons and brothers of VIII the king, together with many other eminent men of the populace, gathered there and begged Caesar to give them his right hand for their security. Although he was very angry at all who still remained, he did not lay aside his old moderation, but received these men. At that time he kept them all in custody, but he bound the king's sons and kinsmen, and led them with him to Rome, to make them hostages for their country's fidelity to the Romans.
And there we leave the temple in ashes, the standards of Rome raised where the altar had stood, and Titus hailed as victor in the smoking court. But the city is not yet wholly taken. Next time, in part 31, the last act, the lower city and then the strong upper city are stormed, Jerusalem falls completely and is given over to destruction, and the long reckoning of the captives and the dead is made. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.